The morning of the third day, the snow had stopped, but the cold had not. Cody Tucker stood at the schoolhouse door and pressed her palm against the wood, feeling for how much warmth had survived the night. The iron stove had burned through the last of the split oak sometime before dawn, and she had fed it the 3 boards she had pried from a broken desk bench, and then a geography primer with a cracked spine, and then she had sat on the floor with 6 children arranged around her like spokes on a wheel, and told them stories until the gray light found the cracks in the sod wall. The children were asleep now, bundled in every coat the room possessed, including hers. The thermometer nailed to the doorframe read 14 degrees. Cody was 26 years old, 5 months out of Jefferson City, Missouri, and hiding as hard as the Colorado Territory would allow. She had not expected the frontier to hide things back. She looked out through the small window at a white world without a road in it, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had made a peculiar kind of peace with this valley. Not because it had been kind to her, because it had been honest in the way that hard things are honest, which is to say it had shown her exactly what it was without apology, and she had found she preferred that to its opposite. She had preferred it, in fact, to almost everything she had left behind. That story began in August of 1883. 6 weeks before the first frost, on a depot platform in Pueblo, Colorado Territory, where a woman stepped off the southbound from Denver carrying 1 canvas bag, 1 lesson satchel, and an aging brown mule she had led into the stock car herself rather than trust a handler she did not know. The mule's name was Biscuit. He was 12 years old that autumn, and had the expression of an animal who had survived too many of a person's decisions to be surprised by any new ones. He stood on the platform and regarded the plains with the same flat patience he regarded everything, and Cody scratched his ear and told him they were 41 miles from Hester Flat, and that the road was supposed to be clear. The road was passable. Whether it was clear was a matter of interpretation. She had answered the school board's advertisement in April when the notice ran in a Jefferson City paper. She had been reading for want of anything better to do in the room she had taken above her aunt's dry goods store. The advertisement said, 1 teacher wanted, Hester Flat District, Fremont County, Colorado Territory, 2 terms per year, 14 pupils enrolled, salary $18 monthly, housing arranged, inquire by letter to D. Kinney, Mercantile. It did not say anything about the condition of the schoolhouse. It did not say anything about what had happened there 2 years prior. Cody would learn, eventually, that omissions were a language this particular valley spoke with considerable fluency. She had reasons of her own for preferring a place no one she knew could find her. The engagement to Wesley Haas had been announced in the paper, as engagements were, and the dissolution of it had been announced in the paper as well, along with an editorial observation by someone who clearly counted himself among Wesley's friends, that the schoolteacher from Buchanan County who had briefly captured the attention of Jefferson City's most eligible young bank examiner had proven herself, on closer acquaintance, unsuitable. The word they had used was unsuitable. Cody had packed 2 days after that paper ran. Her father had been a farrier, working out of Chillicothe, and she had grown up around iron and fire, and the kind of labor that leaves a mark on the hands. She had learned to read from her mother, and learned to fix things from her father, and had gone to the county normal school on a scholarship, and parlayed that into a teaching certificate, and then into a post in Jefferson City. And for 4 years that had been enough. Then it had stopped being enough. Then it had become, briefly and publicly, a disaster, the details of which she did not intend to revisit in Hester Flat or anywhere else. What she found when she reached the valley was not what the advertisement had described. Hester Flat sat in a shallow draw between 2 long ridges, the kind of settlement that had formed around a creek and a post road and had not yet decided whether it intended to grow or to simply persist. There were 40-odd families in the district, a mercantile run by Dora Kinney, a smithy, a small church, and a schoolhouse built of sod on a timber frame that stood at the east edge of the settlement near a cottonwood grove. Dora met her at the mercantile, pressed her hand, and showed her to a room in the back of the building that smelled of dried beans and lamp oil, and told her school would open in 2 weeks and that the board had arranged for a supply of firewood to be delivered before the first cold snap. The firewood did not arrive. The schoolhouse's iron stove had a cracked firebox. 3 of the 4 sod walls had gaps at the corners where the chinking had dried out and fallen, and the October wind moved through them without difficulty. The floor was packed earth, adequate in dry weather, which it had not been since late September. The window glass in the south frame was missing entirely, replaced with oilcloth that had gone brittle at the edges. Cody stood in the middle of all of it the morning before school opened and made a list. She had, from her father, a practiced knowledge of iron, where a crack in a firebox could be repacked with furnace clay and where it could not, which she assessed by running her fingers along the fracture while the stove was cold. This one could be saved. She rode Biscuit to the smithy and explained what she needed to the man there, who had not been expecting a schoolteacher to use the technical vocabulary correctly, and showed it by going quiet for a moment before he mixed her the clay. The sod walls she packed herself over 3 evenings, cutting fresh sod from the creek bank and working it into the gaps with her hands while the light held. The oilcloth she replaced with a piece of actual glass she found in a crate at Dora's mercantile, and she installed it herself with a borrowed putty knife. Otto Crane, who ran the feed supply and held the loudest opinions on the school board, came by on the 3rd day of repairs and stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and watched her work without offering to help. He said she ought to have told the board about the condition of the building. She said the board ought to have told her. He did not answer that, and he left without offering to help, but he came back the next morning, and the cord of firewood that arrived at the schoolhouse door that afternoon carried no note but smelled of the pitch pine Otto Crane kept behind his feed barn. Cody noted that and filed it away. She was good at reading gestures that arrived without language. The 14 children were punctual on the first Monday. She had expected wariness and received curiosity, which was easier to work with. 11 of the 14 were 9 to 13 years old. The 3 youngest were 6 and 7, a pair of brothers named Carl and Walt Myers, and a girl named Bess Sutter, who cried the first morning and did not cry again after Cody let her sit beside the stove with a piece of chalk and draw on the slate board until she felt ready. Among the older children was a girl who sat in the 2nd row, back straight, watching everything Cody did with the evaluating attention of a judge. She had dark hair cut straight across and gray eyes, and answered every question correctly and never once volunteered to answer first. Her name was Ruth Eller. Nate Eller, Ruth's father, was the school board chair, and he came by the schoolhouse on the Friday of the first week in a manner that was technically a board inspection, and was actually something more cautious than that. He was 34, wide through the shoulders with weathered skin and a manner of speaking that involved long pauses in which he appeared to be solving a problem. He looked at the patched firebox and the repaired sod walls and the installed glass, and he said finally that she had done good work. Cody said thank you. He said the board had intended to address the repairs before she arrived. She said she did not doubt it. He looked at her for a moment as if he was calculating whether that was charitable or pointed, and she did not help him decide, and he left. Ruth watched the whole exchange from her desk and said nothing. What Nate had not said, and what Dora Kinney had not said in the weeks of settling in that followed, and what Otto had not said in any of his opinions, was why the schoolhouse had gone 2 years with a cracked stove and no glass in the south window. Cody had noticed the gap in the conversation, the way you notice a missing board in a floor, by the way everything around it was careful. She had other things to attend to. October deepened. The leaves on the cottonwoods went yellow and the ridges went brown, and the mornings required a fire started by 6 o'clock, or the ink in the well froze before the children arrived. Cody learned which students were quick with figures and which needed figures explained through physical objects, and she learned that Carl Myers could not read yet, and that no one had told his parents because his parents did not read either. And she addressed that with a separate set of primers and said nothing to the board. She learned that Ruth Eller did fractions in her head faster than Cody could work them on the board, and that Ruth brought her lunch in a blue tin pail and ate it alone outside regardless of the cold, and that Ruth's father dropped her off each morning without getting down from the wagon. He had not gotten down from the wagon since the board inspection. Cody noticed that too. The drawing arrived on a Thursday in late October, slipped under the door of Cody's room at the Mercantile early enough that the lamp was still burning when she found it. It was done in pencil on the back of a piece of brown wrapping paper. 11 small rectangles, each with a cross above it, arranged in 2 rough rows. Beside each cross, a name written in a child's careful hand. 7 were clearly children's names. 4 were adults. One of the adult names was Eileen Eller. Cody set the drawing on the table and sat with it for a long time. She brought it to Dora the next morning before the children arrived. She set it on the Mercantile counter and asked, without accusation, who Eileen Eller had been. Dora looked at the drawing, then out the window at the frost on the road, then back at Cody. She said that Eileen had been Nate's wife. She said the diphtheria had come in October of 1881 and had moved through the valley in 6 weeks and had taken 11 people, 7 of them children under 12, and 4 of them adults who had nursed the children and contracted it in the nursing. She said the school had been closed and had stayed closed for a full year, and that when it reopened the year after with a new teacher hired from Pueblo, the man had lasted 1 term and gone back to the city, and that the board had placed the advertisement and had not, she said, been altogether truthful about the state of the building, because they had not been altogether ready to believe any teacher would stay, and they had not wanted to scare one off before she could be given a chance. Cody asked whether Ruth had known her mother was one of the dead. Dora said Ruth had been 6 when Eileen died, old enough to remember, and that the child had drawn that picture the same week every year since, and had never once shown it to anyone that Dora knew of. Cody folded the drawing carefully and put it in her lesson satchel and rode Biscuit out to the schoolhouse and started the fire and opened the door and taught school. And she did not tell anyone what she now understood. She had come here to hide. She had arrived in a town that was hiding just as hard, and the hiding had cost everyone in ways that the cracked stove and the missing glass had only been the surface of. That afternoon, after the children had gone, Nate Eller arrived to repair the stovepipe, which had developed a loose joint at the elbow. He had brought his own tools and a new sheet of tin for the collar. Cody was grading the morning's spelling work by the window, and she did not move from her seat, and Nate worked for 20 minutes without speaking. And at the end of it, he said, without turning from the pipe, that he had heard she found the building worse than described, and that he owed her an apology for that. She said she had figured out why the advertisement had left certain things out. He turned then and looked at her. It was the kind of look that was trying to determine how much she meant by a plain sentence. She held it without elaborating. He picked up his tools and said that his daughter had started bringing her lunch inside lately, and that was unusual. Cody said Ruth was welcome to eat inside whenever she liked. He nodded at the stovepipe and said the joint should hold now, and he left. And Cody sat with the spelling papers and the quiet and the winter coming through the repaired walls at a much more manageable pace than before. November was cold and productive. Cody drilled the 14 students in reading, arithmetic, and what she privately categorized as practical reasoning, which the curriculum called geography, but which she used as an occasion to discuss what happened when rivers flooded, when crops failed, when a community had to decide together what to do with a shared problem. She did not mention diphtheria. She did not need to. The children had it in them the way children have everything their parents survive, present but unspoken, surfacing sometimes in the way they treated the space around the schoolhouse, the careful distance they kept from the coughing, the way the older ones watched the younger ones color in winter. Ruth had begun eating her lunch at the desk nearest Cody's chair. She did not talk during it, and Cody did not require her to. In mid-November, Ruth asked if Cody knew what a mixed fraction was, and Cody said she did. And Ruth said that Otto Crane's son had told her that girls didn't need to know mixed fractions because they would never need them. And Cody said that was one of the more useless things she had heard, and proceeded to spend 40 minutes of the lunch hour on every application of mixed fractions she could name, including the measurement of fabric, the scaling of recipes, and the surveying of property lines, which last one Ruth wrote down in a separate notebook she produced from her coat pocket. Cody did not tell her that she had used exactly those arguments to justify the advanced mathematics curriculum to Otto Crane at the November board meeting, and that Otto had said women teachers were welcome to their opinions, but opinions didn't build fences. She had said fences were built on property surveys, and property surveys required fractions, and Otto had said that was not the kind of conversation a board meeting was for. And Cody had smiled pleasantly and moved to the next item on the agenda. December arrived and the valley went white, and the days shortened to a few pale hours, and the nights were serious about their cold. Biscuit grew a winter coat that made him look broader than he was, and stood in the small lean-to behind the mercantile with the philosophical patience of an animal who had wintered before and expected to winter again. Cody had taken to bringing him a handful of dried corn each morning, more ritual than necessity, and he received it with the same equanimity with which he received everything she brought him, which she valued more than she could reasonably explain. The circuit letter arrived in the second week of January, tucked inside a bundle of mail that came up from the rail depot with the supply wagon. It was addressed to the District School Board of Hester Flat, Fremont County, in a hand Cody recognized before she had fully processed what she was looking at, because she had spent 3 years seeing that hand on school board correspondence in Jefferson City. The return address was the Missouri State Board of Education. She did not open it. It was not addressed to her. She delivered it to Dora, who accepted the mail bundle each week, and she rode Biscuit back to the schoolhouse and started the fire and taught fractions and read aloud from a natural history book, and sent the children home at 4 o'clock, and sat for a long time in the empty schoolhouse watching the stove Nate had repaired work its way through 2 pieces of split cottonwood. The letter would say that the schoolteacher hired under the name Cody Tucker had previously been employed by the Jefferson City District under her full name, Cordelia Frances Tucker, and had resigned under circumstances that the Missouri Board considered relevant to her continued employment. The circumstances were: she had refused to dismiss a student whose father had requested his removal, on the grounds that the student in question was the child of a Chinese laundryman, and was, the father had claimed, an unsuitable presence among the other children. Cody had refused the dismissal. The boy's name was Henry. She had refused, had taught Henry through the full spring term, and had been asked by the Jefferson City Board to tender her resignation. She had tendered it. The public shaming, the editorial about unsuitability, and the dissolution of her engagement had followed within the same fortnight. None of that was, technically, a crime. None of it should have required hiding. She had, however, left Missouri without advising the state board of her forwarding address, which they had evidently spent 5 months locating. The blizzard started that same week on a Wednesday morning, arriving from the northwest as a weight of cloud that settled over the ridges before noon and began putting down snow with the quiet industry of something that intended to work all day. Cody looked at it at recess and told the 8 children present to go directly home after school and not to wait for anything. 6 of them had walked to school and lived far enough that they could not make the return trip before the weather closed. She kept them. She sent the 2 who were on horseback out at 2 o'clock with instructions for each of their families and a note she pressed into the older one's hand, detailing who remained and why. Then she barred the door against the wind and added wood to the stove and began inventorying what she had, which was 3 days of split wood in the pile inside, a tin of dried beans, a sack of cornmeal, 2 crocks of water, 6 children between the ages of 7 and 13, and the natural history book, which she had not yet returned to the shelf. The 6 children were Ruth, who was 9, the 2 Myers brothers, Carl and Walt, who were 7 and 8, a girl named Ada Sutter, Bess's older sister, who was 11, and 2 brothers named Tom and James Pitcher, who were 10 and 12, and had the useful quality of going calm in a crisis that some people have and most people do not know they have, until a crisis presents itself. Cody knew exactly 3 stories that had nothing to do with curriculum. She told all 3 in the first night, and then improvised a 4th, and began a 5th, speaking quietly while the wind worked the schoolhouse walls and the snow packed against the south window until the oilcloth bowed slightly inward. The children ate cornmeal mush from the tin pot and fell asleep in layers, the younger ones nearest the stove, Ada and Ruth on the outside like a boarder. Cody did not sleep the first night. She fed the fire every 2 hours and measured the wood with her eye and decided by morning that they could last another 2 days if she was careful. She lost feeling in her fingers the second night. She kept feeding the fire. She rationed the beans through the second day and finished the cornmeal on the 3rd morning and told the children they would eat more beans for dinner, which she said with enough conviction that Bess's older sister Ada asked if she could have extra beans, as she liked them, and Cody said yes and meant it as a kindness to the child and also as a measure of how thoroughly she had lost track of sentiment about food. On the 3rd morning, as noted, the snow stopped. The cold did not. Nate Eller had ridden out on the first day of the blizzard when his 2 children had not returned and had been turned back by drifts on the eastern road, and had ridden out again on the morning of the 2nd day and been turned back again. And on the morning of the 3rd day, he had taken the mule from the lean-to behind the mercantile, because the mule was sturdier in deep snow than his horse, and he knew it, and had gotten through. He arrived at the schoolhouse door at 9 in the morning of the 3rd day, and knocked, and Cody opened the door and looked at him in the flat gray light of the aftermath. And he looked at her, and the 6 children behind her looked at him, and Ruth said, in the tone of a child who has been waiting patiently for something she was not alarmed about, that they were fine. She had said they would be fine. He did not speak immediately. He stepped inside and looked at the stove, at the children, at the firewood reduced to a small pile near the wall, at the empty cornmeal sack and the pot and the beans, and at Cody, who had not slept properly in 3 days and had her coat on the youngest Myers boy and wore instead a shawl she had taken from the peg near the door and didn't particularly look like a woman who had performed a feat, but had. He said finally that he had brought food from the mercantile in the saddlebag and that the road back was passable, slow but passable. She said good. He looked at the stovepipe he had repaired in November, at the collar that had held through 3 days of serious fire, and he nodded at it slightly less to Cody than to some private accounting he was conducting, and she thought she understood what he was settling in that moment, though she would not understand it fully until later. He said she should have left when the weather first turned. She said there hadn't been time to get the children who'd walked out ahead of it. He said he supposed that was right. That was most of what they said that morning. The children went home in pairs with the parents who had assembled on the road, drawn by the same news the first two riders had carried on Wednesday, and by the end of the afternoon the valley knew what had happened in the schoolhouse over 3 days, which was less dramatic in the telling than it would have been in the living, but still circulated with some speed through Hester Flat for the following 2 weeks, carried chiefly by Tom Pitcher, who was 12 and knew the value of a good account. Otto Crane appeared at the schoolhouse door 4 days after the blizzard, while Cody was sweeping the floor, and set a cord of split pine just outside without announcing himself except by the sound of the stacking, and left again without waiting to be thanked. She swept to the door and watched him go and thought of her father, who had expressed approval in very similar ways. The board met the following week. Otto did not suggest she was unsuitable. He sat in the far corner of the room and examined the ceiling while the board discussed whether the firewood supply should be formally doubled for the remainder of the winter season, and decided that it should. If you have sat through something like a blizzard for someone else's children, you know what the valley felt in those weeks. That particular shift in a community's air when a thing that was doubted has been answered. If you haven't, the story is doing its best to show you. The circuit letter came up in February at the next board meeting, after Dora had opened it and read it and passed it to Otto, and Otto had passed it to the third board member, a quiet man named Harlan Webb who kept sheep and said very little, and Harlan had passed it to Nate, who had read it and folded it and said he would take it up with the teacher directly. He came to the schoolhouse on a Friday after the children had left. He set the letter on the desk in front of her without comment. She picked it up and read it, which was unnecessary since she already knew what it said, and set it back down. She told him who Henry had been. She told him what she had refused to do, and why the Missouri board had taken it the way they had, and why the editorial had been written the way it had been written. And she told him about Wesley Haas, not because she owed him the full account, but because it turned out she had been carrying it a long way, and she was tired. She said she supposed the board would need to make a decision. Nate looked at the letter for a moment. Then he said that the valley had hired a teacher by letter without telling her the schoolhouse had no working stove and no glass in the south window and no firewood arranged, and had not mentioned 11 deaths that had preceded her employment, including the death of the previous teacher, and had then watched while she repaired what the board should have repaired and kept 6 children alive through a 3-day blizzard that no one had been able to ride through until it was over. He said he was not sure what decision the board was going to make, but his vote was already cast. She looked at him across the desk with the letter between them and the evening light coming through the south window, which had good glass in it now, and she said that the valley's secret had cost it considerably more than hers had cost Missouri. He said that was true. The board did not act on the Missouri letter. Harlan Webb voted with Nate. Otto Crane did not vote against, which, in Cody's experience of Otto Crane by that point, was equivalent to a yes. Spring came to Hester Flat the way it comes to high valleys, reluctantly and then all at once, the creek running loud in March, the ridges greening from the bottom upward through April, the cottonwoods by the schoolhouse putting out their first leaves in a particular pale green that Cody had come to think of as the valley's best color. She opened the schoolhouse windows in May and let the air move through and taught the last weeks of the second term, with the smell of wet grass and wood smoke coming in together. Ruth came to her on the last Friday of the term and stood at her desk with her notebook and asked if Cody would teach her cursive over the summer. She said she had been working on it from the primer, but that her lowercase letters ran together, and she couldn't tell if it was her or the primer. Cody said it was neither. It was practice, and that she would be happy to work on it through July if Ruth wanted to come by. She set it to the desk, busy with the term's final records, and looked up when Ruth did not immediately reply. Ruth was watching her with those evaluating gray eyes, and then she said that she was glad the board had hired Cody and not someone else. She said this with the considered delivery of a child who has been thinking about a sentence for a while before speaking it. Cody set down her pen and said she was glad too. Nate had begun in April to stop the wagon and climb down when he dropped Ruth off. He would stand at the schoolhouse door for a few minutes on most mornings, not always saying much, sometimes looking at the cottonwoods or the ridgeline or the way the morning light hit the valley floor, and eventually saying something that was technically about the weather or the creek levels or the herd and was actually about something else. Cody was good at that kind of conversation. She had her father's gift for it, the ability to discuss the fences while really discussing the field. He asked her in late May whether she had ever considered staying past the current contract. She said she had been considering it. He asked whether the valley was what she had expected when she answered the advertisement. She said no, not remotely. He looked at the cottonwoods and said that was honest of her. She said he had asked an honest question. He said that Eileen had been the one who talked easily, and that he had never been able to do it as well, and that he had missed it more than he had been able to say to anyone. She said that was a hard thing to lose. He said it was. They stood in the morning light for a minute that stretched into 2, and neither of them filled it with anything unnecessary. And that particular shared silence was, in its way, more honest than a great deal of what most people call conversation. The wedding was in July, on a Saturday afternoon, with the circuit preacher who came through every 6 weeks and knew the valley well enough to make the service short and warm and useful. Dora Kinney was there, and Otto Crane, who stood in the back and held his hat in both hands, and Harlan Webb, who had brought his wife and 3 children. The Myers brothers were there because their mother had come, and they ate most of the cake. Ruth stood beside her father and held a stem of wild larkspur from the ridge, and did not cry, which Cody would later note was about what she expected from Ruth. Biscuit was tied to the cottonwood outside, and ate the lower leaves within his reach, and was uninterested in the ceremony. What happened after that is what happened in any valley where 2 people have decided, with open eyes, to make a hard life together. The winters came and were survived. A second child arrived in 1886, a boy they named Thomas, and a third in 1889, a girl they named Clara. The herd grew and the hay crops went well in some years and poorly in others. The schoolhouse roof was replaced in 1891 with proper timber framing and shiplap boards, the sod walls relined with cut lumber, the floor laid in plank. Cody taught through 3 different territorial school board administrations and 2 changes of county government and the arrival of statehood, which formalized certain things and changed nothing material about the teaching. Otto Crane never formally apologized for the November board meeting or for anything else he had ever said about women teachers. What he did instead was arrive each October with a double cord of split pine and leave it at the schoolhouse without waiting to be thanked. And he did this every year for the remaining 17 years he lived in the valley. And when he was no longer strong enough to split it himself, his youngest son split it and delivered it in his name, and Cody always left a plate of cornbread on the fence post for whoever delivered it. And it was always gone when she came back. Ruth learned cursive over the summer of 1884 and never again had difficulty with her lowercase letters. She read every book Cody owned, which by 1887 was a considerable number, and studied through the mail order courses that reached the valley from the Denver colleges. And in 1895, at the age of 21, she received her teaching certificate and was hired by the next district over, in a schoolhouse that was in considerably better repair than the one her stepmother had arrived at. She sent Cody a letter about it. Cody kept it in the lesson satchel she had carried from Missouri, the same one she had carried onto the depot platform in Pueblo, with Biscuit walking beside her in the summer heat. Nate died in the winter of 1914, in his 65th year, of a lung ailment that had been building since a bad winter in 1910, and had not been addressed with sufficient seriousness until it was too late. He was buried on the south ridge above the homestead, inside of the schoolhouse, in a plot they had discussed so many times over so many mornings that the location was as settled a thing as any in the valley. Cody put a stone there herself, cutting the letters in a manner her father would have recognized, clean and practical and without excess. She taught school for 7 more years after that. The valley had changed around her, the railroad spur reaching Hester Flat in 1901, the road to the depot graded and leveled in 1906, the schoolhouse eventually given a second room and a proper vestibule in 1912. The 14 students of 1883 had become 30 by the time she retired in the autumn of 1921. Biscuit had died in the spring of 1893, at 22 years, in the lean-to behind what was now no longer a mercantile room, but a proper house Nate had built onto the back of the property. He had lain down one morning and not gotten up, and Cody had sat with him for an hour in the straw and talked to him in the way you talk to an animal who has known you at your worst and your most uncertain and your most stubborn, which is to say plainly and without embarrassment. She buried him at the east edge of the schoolhouse lot, near the cottonwood, and marked the spot with a flat river stone, what you can sometimes find in Hester Flat. Even now, if you look at the old schoolhouse building that still stands on the east side of the settlement, is a line of small letters carved into the doorframe at a height that would have been at eye level for someone standing and reaching up. Not a name, not a date, a sentence pressed into the wood in the careful block letters of someone who had once been told she was unsuitable, and had not, in the end, given that word any more weight than it deserved. It says, "Every child belongs in this room." The valley kept both their secrets in the end, the one Cody had carried across a state line, and the one the valley had carried through 2 years of closed doors, and set them down when it was time. That is not a small thing in a hard place. It is, in fact, the thing that makes a hard place livable. Not the forgetting of what was lost, but the decision, made quietly and by effort and without ceremony, to go on being the kind of place where someone might show up with an aging mule and a canvas bag and find, underneath the disrepair and the silence, that she was not the only one who had been waiting for someone willing to stay,